Welcome to the webinar Addressing the Crisis with a Resilient Power Market System Design and Electricity Prices in Check. My name is Nicola Bock. I'm Events Lead at Agora Energiewende and very happy to see, 112 participants already in the webinar. Since Russia's war against Ukraine, there's a lack of fossil fuel supplies from Russia, and decision makers are looking for ways to ensure that rising fossil fuel prices do not translate into rising electricity prices for households and businesses. A reform of the EU electricity market design is seen as part of the discussion or the solution. And Agora Energiewende has therefore commissioned the consultancy Guidehouse to take a closer look at various reform options and how they could contribute to political objectives. Based on this analysis, Agora Energiewende has developed a proposal to make the EU power market more resilient in crisis. The paper will soon be on our website. It's not yet ready for publication, but we have decided to still present the results during this webinar. And we will have the authors of the study from Guidehouse and Agora Energiewende on stage in a couple of minutes. And I've already seen Matthias Buck, who will do the moderation in 1 minute. Let me just introduce you to how the next 70 minutes are structured. We will have 2 presentations, one from Guidehouse and one from Agora Energiewende. And then the rest of the time, approximately 20 to 30 minutes, is reserved for your questions so that we can have a lively debate in the Q&A session. And now, Matthias, please switch on your camera and microphone. Matthias heads the EU work of Agora Energiewende. He's Director EU from Agora Energiewende and the moderator of today's webinar. And I'm very happy to hand over the microphone to you and look forward to what's coming in the next 70 minutes.
Thank you, Nicola, and welcome to everyone out there. I hope you are not as annoyed as I am from the work noise next door. I'm moderating from my home office and there works just in the environment. So welcome to all. What's the topic today? When I joined Agora Energiewende some years ago, power market design was an issue for nerds, really. Now since the fossil fuel supply crisis and the energy price crisis, the functioning of wholesale market price formation is suddenly an issue that is discussed at heads of state level in Europe, and whether the way the system as it stands today is working well for the public benefit. So we are seeing an exponential expansion really of the community discussing power market design in Europe. And this new situation led us at Agora to commission Guidehouse to develop an explanatory paper really on the different options under discussion and to give an indication of the pros and cons and strengths and weaknesses of the several ideas on how the power market design could eventually be further developed so to shield consumers and industry from extremely high prices. Now, this decision we took some months ago, actually, and since then, the political discussion has accelerated even further. The Commission President Ursula von der Leyen announced that the Commission will come with a proposal for reform of Europe's power market design in Q1 next year. So I would expect in February, March next year, 2023, and a public consultation on ideas for reforming the power market design will open still before Christmas. This is the last information I got yesterday. So against this background, we have, on the basis of the mapping done by Guidehouse colleagues, also started to look into concrete ideas for reforming from Agora side, and we have, of course, done this in close discussion with colleagues from Guidehouse. Now, this is the background to today's meeting. The public consultation on the power market design by the Commission has not yet started. I expect it will open in still before Christmas, as said, and of course, it would be important for all progressive voices to come in and to participate and really have a rich and very well articulated development of ideas going forward. So we will do our share to have a well-informed debate, and today's webinar is really trying to contribute to this. As Nicola said, we have about 1 hour to go from now, so I will just start opening, introducing the participants. One word on the participation. At Agora, we have a policy to not have all male panels. Now, unfortunately, what happened is that our executive director, Frauke Thies, fell ill last night. She sent me a message this morning saying, Matthias, I need to stand, but I cannot do this webinar. She was going to present the Agora input to this session. And so we were going back and forth a bit and eventually decided to still go ahead with the webinar despite all panelists being male. So I apologize for that. The alternative would have been to have the 240 pre-registered participants just cancel the meeting, and we said no. The topic is too urgent to now not go ahead with the presentation. So I apologize. I can also invite all women out there listening perhaps to this presentation today. Please apply for some of the positions opening at Agora for power market design work. We have, I believe, 2 positions open at the moment. And normally the applications coming in are predominantly from men, perhaps because it's a very technical topic, I don't know. But we in the team would really enjoy having more women working on power market design. Unfortunately, Frau Thies cannot do the presentation today. Let's go to the substance. We have 2 presentations. First, colleagues from Guidehouse, Konstantin Stachus and Christian Nabe, will present essentially the mapping, as I said, the strengths and weaknesses of different ideas under discussion. And then we will go straight to the presentation of the Agora ideas for what could and should happen on further development of power market design early next year, hopefully, and this will be presented by my colleague Christian Redl. Other Agora colleagues will work in the background to pick up the questions that you can put into the chat, as Nicola has been indicating. So now I hand over to Konstantin, I believe. No? You will do the presentation?
Yes, thank you very much, Matthias. I'm going to try to hit the right button for sharing the right screen, which is always the riskiest part, I think. Does this one look correct?
Very good.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction. This was a joint work primarily of the 2 of us listed in blue there on the left, Christian Nabe, who has been with Guidehouse and its predecessor consulting organizations for a long time, and myself with some background in utility and especially system operator associations, including NSOE in Brussels for 8 years. And we were very happy to be able to support Agora with some analysis and ideas on this title that Matthias has already introduced. The pictures we chose on the right sort of show hopefully the solution. We have a good, well-functioning market design achieving most of the purposes it was done for until very recently, very nicely in Europe. And we're hoping that we can find a European solution to improve things further with respect of protecting consumers in this very crisis. And the problem at the bottom is, well, if we're heating, at least in Germany, and I think quite a few other countries this winter, 19 degrees is often not what's needed. We might need 18 degrees, ideally. And that, of course, is a bit of a difficulty. But now into the content. This is a slide we've jointly developed with Agora. Many of you have probably seen the price development over and over again. You can see it came from levels in euros per megawatt hour far under 100, which we all got used to over decades and which we took granted as normal. And we worried about all kinds of resiliency, more and more, especially in the last few years, but not so much about resiliency with respect to the balance of the benefits from the power market flowing to producers of electricity versus consumers of electricity. And that's by now become a major problem, given how the gas prices exploded and through them, the electricity prices also, with a market design that in the merit order with the pay-as-clear system leads the highest cost resources on the margin to determine the electricity price. So as the gas price moved up, the marginal price of electricity on the power exchanges moved up quite a bit. And several customers felt that immediately. If large industrials, for example, rely on the power exchanges for a significant part of their demand, and others will feel it sooner or later as their contracts with their supplier expire and the price can be adjusted upwards. So a huge burden for customers, especially if one considers what many of us have learned when we've worked in electricity for a while, how incredibly valuable electricity is to consumers. In the European Union, we try to get a better and better handle of the value of electricity to consumers by looking at the value of lost load, asking consumers, if you imagine you had a blackout, how much would you be willing to pay to avoid it? And that's sometimes a factor of 100 or so higher than what consumers actually pay. They might be paying 20 cents a kilowatt hour. It might be worth to them over 20 euros a kilowatt hour, depending on what kind of customers they are. Now, of course, the power market has the fantastic effect that it incentivizes customers to save energy when the prices are very high, and that's functioning, and we don't want to lose that. On the other hand, if the price that customers pay goes up double or so, then that can be seen, and that's the basis of the current political discussion, as a straightforward transfer from the consumer side. They have much less money to spend on other things to the producer side. Delayed by them having different kinds of contract, but still with an order of magnitude, that's okay. Now, and that's a crisis that's happening now. You see in the dotted line that over the next few years, the expectation of the power market, the futures market in this case, is that high prices will come down, but relatively slowly over a few years. So we need power market design adjustments, if they're supposed to help, that help relatively quickly, because the problem might have largely gone away in a few years. If we take too long to find the solution, that doesn't help us very much. Investments only come in bit by bit. So the investment incentives are a super important part that we must not destroy, but we must keep in mind that the solutions for protecting the consumers will have only a slow effect if we rely solely on the investments. One other thing in the middle bullet that I wanted to emphasize before we move on, the power market prices, as you can see in the graph, have been elevated for quite a few months right now and have been elevated a lot over the prior 50 euros a megawatt hour or so level. So the investment incentives from these scarcity prices have already accumulated for 15 months or so. That's quite a bit. There can be a legitimate worry that if at the first sign of scarcity, for example, in a windless winter week, the politicians all start adjusting the market design, then nobody trusts the market design anymore for investment incentives. But they're not starting to fiddle with it at the first sign. we're 15 months into the crisis right now. Quite a few of investment incentives have accumulated already. So that's another justification for this discussion, which is going on rightly in Europe. So we're asking the questions, which key requirements does the European market design need to fulfill? Those will be our criteria for evaluating different options for adjusting different market design parameters that might help in the specific case right now. You will see with Christian's slides that there's lots of parameters, but only a few really help with the current crisis and the consumer protection. And we then will settle on what's the recommended way forward from looking at a small set of options. Last slide that I wanted to show before I pass over to Christian is in looking at the specific things we might adjust in the market design in order to protect consumers in the current rather unusual crisis. We must not forget that the power market design got to be compatible with the requirements of the energy transition. We have these super important decarbonization goals, 2050, Europe-wide, 2045, in Germany already. So competition is good and is partly needed in order to stimulate innovation in generation and supply towards decarbonization, to foster market integration, because that makes it easier to integrate and utilize large amounts, dominating amounts of fluctuating renewables, to support decentralized generation investment, also governance for those investments being decentralized and supported very strongly by digitalization. And finally, also one criteria will be, as we've learned the hard way, to deal with fuel scarcities and fuel price shocks. And with that, with that, I pass it over to Christian to take us through the next 10 or so slides.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Konstantin, for the introduction. Yeah, I'm going to dive now a bit into the details of market design. And what you see here is an overview of possible design parameters for a power market. And we've taken that slide from a current discussion process which is going on in the UK, which is not specifically related to dealing with gas crisis, but it's I think it's a very good overview of possible parameters you can turn. And in the upper half of the slide, you see all those parameters that concern the market operation, also the wholesale market, and the lower, the bottom part is all kind of parameters in discussion on the investment side. And although this discussion is not directly related to the gas crisis, we've taken this overview anyway, because there's so much discussion going on that even fundamentals should be changed. So what we have done in the study and what I will present now is obviously only a very short overview of what we have done. Is we took a look at different parameters and we then evaluated them against the criteria, and we came to a conclusion on which parameters are worth thinking on the change, or whether it makes sense to keep them as they are. So can you please move the next slide, please? Yeah, so I would say the most obvious design parameter to change would be the price formation, which is actually the link from gas prices to power prices, and there's a lot of discussion going on whether a pay-as bid mechanism as an alternative to the current pay-as-clear would be a good way forward. Then we would have average pricing, and then we would get the gas prices down immediately. But however, it is also clear from the academic discussion, but also from practical experiences, that this is not a good solution. as it is clear that market participants will estimate the marginal price, and therefore there will be no real impact to market prices, except that a lot of discussion will be going on, and a lot of insecurity will be introduced in the market. So please go on. We have excluded this option for a next evaluation step. Another thought was maybe it would help to make a fundamental step away from the self-dispatch system we have at the moment to a central dispatch. We know that this step is frequently discussed in terms of nodal pricing, and we don't have a nodal pricing discussion at the moment. But however, in the central dispatch system, you would have a closer grip on the bids of the market participants, as there is unit-based bidding, and there's also a very strong regulatory control over the bids. So this might be a helpful thing to have in combination with the change of the price formation, and go like for a step into a more regulated price bids, like a cost-based bids. But as we don't want to have this discussion on central dispatch only related to the gas prices, we have also decided to exclude this option for further discussion, as we think it is also it's not a central feature of central dispatch to have stronger regulated bids. And last not least, we have also taken a look at the ideas of market splitting. This is also known as the Greek proposal, whether to have the low operational cost technologies in a separate market, and the higher cost gas price driven technologies in a different market, and then go to average pricing at the end. But there was also an intensive discussion of this proposal in the past weeks, and also we have concluded that it's not worth following, as we have a lot of detailed problems with arbitrage between the two markets and portfolio bidding and so forth. And so we have decided not to go into this direction and take a closer look. So basically, we see that all proposals which are on the table at the moment that affect directly the wholesale market operation, they are not worth to follow. But then we have taken a look at other parts of this graph, and this is the so-called complementary measures. So as we have excluded the first three sets of options from this, we will look at further options. And these are PPA support and contracts for differences. And we will go on with a deeper analysis on these ones. So these options are actually discussed in the framework of support schemes, and actually not directly designed for dealing with gas prices. But we have seen that those market participants who have long-term contracts or a two-sided CFDs, they're actually are isolated from the current price shocks we have. And so the immediate question comes up whether these options are worth following up and implementing on a wider European base. Additionally to those, to contracts for differences, which you see here, there's also discussion on power purchase agreement support on a European scale, quite for a while. So we have taken this discussion also up in our set of options. So that means we come up with 3 options we're going to examine further. Option 1's PPA support means that the numerous difficulties we have with long-term PPAs at the moment are removed. These are very different in countries, and they might relate also to the guarantees of origin problems, and other supportive measures can be implemented. Option 2 is that we have, and that's important, 2-sided contracts for differences to the support of low carbon technologies, as we know in some countries in Europe already. And we also think it's worthwhile to have the system open for entry for existing generators not in this scheme yet. And the next option would be to have this thing, but mandatory for all new carbon technologies. Next slide, please. This is the evaluation scheme we're going to look at, and basically it is based on the 3 main targets of European energy policy. And we have taken the implementation efforts and adaptability as a 4th criterion. And we have defined sub-criteria for all of this to make it more operational. Next slide, please. So what you see here already is the final result of our evaluation. As you see, we have taken a very simple scale to evaluate these options. And the scale is whether implementing this option is an improvement over the status quo we have, whether pros and cons are balanced, or kind of the same situation as before, or whether this introduction of this option would worsening the situation compared to now. Again, looking at the bullets now, we already see that the PPA support, which is a rather soft option, would not change too much, but we have some interesting signals and evaluation differences between the 2 other options. Let's go on to the next slide. I will not go on and explain every evaluation point, but you will have this in our complete report, which will be published soon. Overall, we see that the voluntary CFD score best compared to status quo. And we also see a lot of problems with the mandatory CFD, while the PPA support does not change a lot, as this is a rather soft measure also. I think the crucial difference, or the crucial feature of the CFD, is that they offer a government-backed security for investments, and therefore has the potential to increase the consumer surplus. This would be reached by mandatory CFDs as well, but the mandatory aspect has the problem that the innovation aspect is rather difficult to handle, as all kind of technologies would have to be handled by an auction mechanism. Let's go on. With respect to climate targets, I think it's important to have investment security for that are provided by CFD, and that's why the CFD options score so well. But in respect to implementation, it is also clear that that the more administration and the more regulatory impact you would like to have, the more difficult would it be to implement. PPA support is obviously the most easiest to implement. Voluntary CFD is easy as well, not that easy. But for if you don't want to have a mandatory system, I think this will require a lot of administration, and also you might face legal problems here. We see that that voluntary CFDs provide security, and since they are long term, they also provide this is a good option to deal with future price shocks. And the more technologies we have into that option, the more and the better would be the security we get for both generators and finally also for consumers. Next slide. Yeah, so this was a short overview of the evaluation we made, and we are happy to discuss further. And I hand back to Konstantin now for our summary and conclusions.
Yeah, thanks, Christian. And in the interest of time, I'll try to go fast. So in the paper, we also looked at the history, evolution, and the particularities of the electricity markets, including, for example, this very high consumer surplus, the very high benefit of electricity to customers, the main targets they got to achieve, and the current challenges. We concentrated, as Christian has explained, for now, especially on those few options with especially low implementation barriers, where neither a lot of information technology adjustments would be needed. For example, if the power exchanges adjust their price formation algorithm, that would take years just on the IT side and another few years to figure it out what you really want to do politically all over Europe beforehand. But the options we've chosen could be implemented significantly faster, partly because there's few legislative barriers against them. Some harder to implement options may become part of later, some people call it fifth package discussions, especially if they might support high shares of renewables in the power system, which we're aiming for, which they might support complete decarbonization, which might bring or especially encourage the use of flexibilities. We evaluated the PPAs and the voluntary as well as the mandatory CFDs against the main targets and the sub-targets, especially consumer protection, where the idea was if there's a two-sided CFD, either voluntary or mandatory, then the investors are guaranteed whatever price comes out in the auction for the lifetime of their investment. And in figuring out what's the right price in the auction, everybody would want to look not only at what today's market price level is, but also what's expected in the future, hopefully much lower again, but with huge uncertainties. And the bullet item at the very end shows that this uncertainty alone might be an argument to go for two-sided CFDs, because if they're guaranteed some price level over the 15 or 20 years of their economic lifetime, they can get loans much easier and at lower rates than they otherwise might be. So the overall costs might get lower substantially, especially in an environment where the interest rates are now quite a bit higher and might stay higher for quite a few years. The consumer protection effect is on the other side, and especially important in the next few years. So if they agree to some level of price, which is some expectation over 15 years of where the market prices might be, that will be hopefully significantly below the price level now and over the next few years. And if they participate in the market, if they get dispatched, they get the very high market prices. But in the end, through the two-sided CFD, they only get the price that they agreed to in the auction. So the government, the regulator, the TSOs, whoever ends up administering the scheme, will get the surplus money and be able to distribute it back to the customers, which is the important idea of how CFDs and similarly PPAs would help with the current needed consumer protection during the crisis time. The effect of that would obviously grow the more new investments would have such CFDs. The short-term effect would depend pretty strongly on whether there's uptake by existing resources that might get offered such CFDs. The more existing ones, obviously, the more short-term effect on consumer protection. Can they be enticed to do that? Well, this last bullet item might be one of the arguments for why there could be hope that some substantial fraction of existing resources that otherwise would benefit from the high market prices might go for something like that, and there would be a stronger short-term effect. In our opinion, not as strong for mandatory CFDs because of all the discussion of how this would work. Forcing everybody into something would only work for new resources anyway, and with all the discussions whether there would be any incentive left for the existing resources seems doubtful to us. So the CFDs smoothen and make less risky the contributions to margin for investors, and in the end, we believe help protect consumers during high prices. May cost more than market prices in the future, but that would be part of the bargain. We need the protection now and in the next few years. That's our summary for now, and I pass it back to Matthias.
Yes, thank you, Konstantin. Thank you, Christian. And I would hand straight over to my colleague Christian Redl to present essentially the outcome of the discussion that we've had on the basis of this mapping exercise done by Guidehouse colleagues. Christian, the floor is yours. And then we open for discussion. Afterwards, I see there are many interesting questions coming in the chat. So please continue to ask. When you have questions, we will take them up as much as possible in the concluding part of this webinar. Christian, over to you.
Thank you very much, Matthias. I hope you can see my slide and it's working well. I don't see any objections. Great. Yeah, dear audience, very good morning. First of all, before I start, let me thank the Guidehouse colleagues, Christian and Konstantin, for the excellent collaboration. We had really very inspiring discussions over the last weeks that also helped us, Agora, to develop our proposal. And here I also would like to mention that this was a team effort. So Matthias, of course, Matthias Buck, Frauke Thies, Alexander Dusold, Fabian Hein, Thorsten Lenk and Simon Müller, they all contributed to this. And I think we are quite timely now with this webinar to present our ideas. Yeah, as said also in the previous presentation, it's really important that the structural adjustment of the power market design has to improve on several elements. Yeah, we have to ensure that efficiency is ensured, flexibility. I will talk about that later, security of supply, and also, of course, innovation, because we have to bear in mind our power systems actually in a bit more than 10 years will have to be very close to zero emission power systems throughout Europe. You have probably guessed from the previous analysis of Guidehouse that our proposal focuses on two elements. The one being the introduction of voluntary two-sided contracts for differences for renewables. But we also believe that a more coordinated approach and the introduction of windfall profit taxes is a better approach than the currently implemented inframarginal revenue cap, or member states are currently implementing this inframarginal revenue cap. I will talk about those two elements a bit more in a few minutes, but let me take a step back on this future power market and power system we need. Basically, we need largely emission-free power throughout Europe by 2035, where two technologies, wind and solar PV, will be at the core. And this early decarbonization of the power system is really a main pillar also for the other sectors, such that the European Union in its entirety can become climate neutral by latest 2050. Here you can see a snapshot of an upcoming analysis. We are currently wrapping up together with Artelis, which prepares a scenario for this emission-free power system in Europe. And you can really see that wind and solar PV are at the core of power generation, hence also at the core of needed new investments for cost efficiency reasons, of course, next to emission reduction reasons. But we also need a bunch of new flexibility options to complement the variability from PV and wind. This is obviously storage, battery storage, hydro storage, but also then increasingly power plants fueled by green hydrogen that take over from fossil fuel, specifically fossil gas power plants. Demand side response, of course, is important, and the whole topic, or that links to the whole topic of sector coupling. Industrial heat pumps, for example, electric mobility. So using more and more electricity, green electricity, to decarbonize those sectors, but also use the flexibility those sectors can bring for security of supply in the power system. That means renewables, of course, they will in turn establish the resilience to fossil fuel price shocks, but to reach this 2035 milestone, we also need an unprecedented ramp up of renewables, specifically wind and PV. And you can see here what's needed is actually at least a tripling of annual installation rates. For some technologies, we need to even quadruple the annual deployment over the next years up to 2030. Now, this new system, this zero emission system will be much more decentralized compared to the traditional system with large power plants feeding into the transmission grid and then distributing this electricity to the final consumers. So demand and supply will meet actually on all levels of the power system. And as said, this also brings, of course, also the room for many new flexibility actors that we will need to ensure security of supply. Now, linking again to the power market design discussion, I've said in the beginning, and we also heard it in the guidance presentation, it's really, we need to rely on efficient price signals to coordinate these millions of consumers and producers. And here, marginal pricing on the wholesale market level is really key. As we've heard, average pricing would be clearly counterproductive. It would reduce strongly investment incentives for flexibility options, specifically on the demand side, but would also distort the exchange of electricity throughout the internal European electricity market. Average pricing, as we've also heard, could in principle work through pay-as-bid pricing, but both theory and practice have shown that then market parties simply try to guess what is the price of the marginal bid needed, and then it would essentially again replicate marginal pricing with additional inefficiency implications. So if a pay-as-bid scheme would need to work, it would need to be heavily regulated. This comes again with challenges, hampers innovation, again, the flexibility provision. So many downsides. Now, Turning to these two elements of voluntary CFDs and windfall taxes, what Konstantin and Christian also have mentioned, both enable also revenues for redistribution such that this price crisis is then more addressed, let's say, on the retail or end consumer price level. Now, voluntary two-sided CFDs, well, they reduce uncertainties for renewables investors. Konstantin has mentioned this. Renewables, in terms of the average generation costs, are, of course, the cheapest technologies for new generation, but they are very capital cost intensive. That means they are quite heavily affected by the cost of capital. And just to put this in perspective, let's say the cost of capital increased by 1 percentage point. That means that the LCOE, the levelized cost of electricity, so the average full generation costs per megawatt hour for onshore wind would increase by 8%. So it's really sensible from a systems perspective to minimize costs, of course, through dedicated investment frameworks, which can de-risk these renewables investments, provide revenue stabilization, lower cost of capital, thus even lower the costs of new renewables electricity. Here, we think that a key instrument are these two-sided CFDs. They can both combine long-term investor uncertainty, but also short-term market functioning and efficient market integration of the renewables. And by design, it was also mentioned by Konstantin, they automatically eliminate windfall profits because any, let's say, power market income that is above the strike price has to be paid back. And this income can then be redistributed, of course. Now, to again pick up this discussion on voluntary versus mandatory, it's really important. You have seen this required investment needs on the renewables front. We need ever more new renewables. So we need both merchant renewables. We need renewables that undergo then the more traditional public instruments. The PPAs, they are important for further spurring innovation, bring new products to the market, and both in parallel can allow to reach the deep renewables deployment that is needed. And maybe also linking to the current discussion on the competitiveness of the European energy-intensive industry, specifically vis-a-vis the discussions or developments in the US with the Inflation Reduction Act. They can also be, these voluntary CFDs, be nicely coupled with the idea to pool, for example, corporate PPAs between energy-intensive industries and RES developers, where the governments take an intermediate role, such as minimizing then important counterparty risks. Mandatory CFDs would hinder a lot of this innovation, would essentially preclude or prohibit merchant-based renewables, specifically in times, of course, when we need every new renewable technology. Again, they might be implemented and linked with average pricing elements, which would do quite some harm for the efficient integration and raising of the potential of demand-side flexibility. And also, of course, would constitute a barrier for certain subtypes of RES investments. Self-generation would presumably become difficult. Also, community projects might suffer quite a bit from this, such that we think they really would put deep deployment and reaching according targets at risk. Now, the second element I want to touch upon briefly is this more common approach to taxing and accordingly redistributing windfall profits. We think this is preferable to an extension of the infant marginal revenue cap. First of all, of course, it's sensible to raise the required revenues for the required targeted relief with energy companies that gain windfall profits. This is currently implemented through the Emergency Council regulation, which provides that the revenue of inframarginal technologies can be kept at maximum 180 euros per megawatt hours. Several member states, as we speak, are implementing this. We think that this revenue cap really comes with serious implementation challenges. One can think of different trading strategies that start to emerge to avoid falling under the cap. The market designs throughout Europe actually differ in quite some significant details, balancing market, shortage pricing, etc., etc. So this would raise, first of all, again, quite some distortions between the power markets of the member states, but would really be very, very challenging to implement from the regulation point of view. As such, we think that windfall profit taxes are the better alternative. So to speak, the good news is that with the increased introduction of voluntary CFDs, that over time the need for price interventions is reduced even in such price crisis situations. At any rate, given this, we also believe that any revenue control mechanism needs to come with a specific end date. Now, allow me at the end to touch upon some additional complementary elements that regard state aid, generally permitting policies for renewables, but also further refinements to the existing short-term markets. Now, first of all, it would be important that new renewables capacity that is built through this voluntary CFD actually receives automatic state aid approval. Importantly, RES planning and permitting barriers need to be eliminated. Here we still see quite long permitting periods in several member states. And again, we need to quickly boost renewables deployment. With respect to security of supply, it's really important that any measures to safeguard security of supply are performed in a minimally invasive manner to ensure that they are consistent specifically with the decarbonization objectives. I mentioned this 2035, let's say, milestone of almost complete zero emission power systems, and also importantly, they need to contribute to increasing power system flexibility and not constitute a barrier for that. So there are different instruments which can work quite well with these objectives. Strategic reserves which operate outside of the power market, shortage pricing mechanisms that can help within the electricity market to properly transfer or transmit the value of electricity in real time, but also enable flexibility. And if capacity instruments are implemented market at once, they should rather be capability instruments. So it's really not about how much capacity, but what type and quality of capacity. And then with respect to short-term energy market design, I mean, the clean energy package, the electricity regulation has, I think, done a very good job, can do a very good job if properly implemented. So it's still a lot about implementation of the existing framework, but also there the framework can be further improved, reducing gate closure times, quarterly, hourly trading periods, also in the day-ahead market, strengthening cross-border intraday auctions to have a more efficient coupling of markets closer to real-time. For the demand side, time-varying grid charges can also trigger important flexibility incentives. And obviously, it's going on for a long time, looking at bidding zones and adjusting bidding zones to make a better use of the existing network is also important. And maybe the bigger picture, when we talk about net zero power systems, we also need to look at the other sectors where not only, of course, electricity is used, but to get this more holistic view of how the whole infrastructure needs to evolve to end up with a cost-efficient net zero power system, which brings a lot of importance, again, of renewable electricity, less importance of a molecule-based decarbonization, and then the implications for the according gas grids. So this infrastructure planning perspective take into account both electricity, gas, hydrogen, etc. Heating grids obviously needs to play a prominent role, and all of these elements then can be perceived of a bit more broader view of power market design, all enabling the renewables deployment that we need, and ensuring then also that measures are in place to keep prices for final consumers in check. With this, I hand back over to you, Matthias, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Christian. That's quite a comprehensive overview that you've given. I would probably invite Konstantin and Christian Nabe to also switch on their cameras now that we move to the discussion part. So there are many questions coming in. Unfortunately, we only have a bit over 10 minutes time left for the webinar. So I will pick out some that seem to really go to some of the analysis presented. So there's a question and there are several questions on the relationship between the CFDs and the PPAs. In the asked, and I just take one by Naomi Chevillard, and she's asking whether by relying or putting the CFDs so much in the focus, we wouldn't do or give insufficient attention to PPAs and how we see the relationship there. My understanding is that in particular, there could be good coexistence between PPAs and voluntary CFDs, whereas this would not be the case with mandatory CFDs. And this is what I really learned, that there could be essentially a need to get a permit for anything if you go for mandatory CFD regime. I don't know who wants to pick this up. Konstantin, you were nodding. Perhaps you want to come in on this one.
Yeah, I can at least start. That's exactly the argument that I think is decisive. The PPAs can go along very well with the voluntary CFDs. And PPAs have many advantages, innovation, special solutions fitting for specific industries or specific companies that administer lots of buildings, or electric vehicle charging companies or whatever. And we definitely don't want to get rid of the innovation that comes from these very different energy market partners contracting directly according to their very specific needs. Mandatory CFDs, we fear would essentially kill that. And even if one starts talking about de minimis sizes that are exempted from mandatory CFDs, this would all get very woolly, very complicated, and we fear at least some necessary innovation and flexibility would bite the dust, would not survive. We need the flexibility, we need the innovation.
Thank you, Konstantin. And perhaps, I think that this is fairly clear. So the analysis that we're presenting is not so much focusing on the PPAs as something that we really believe, and this is also very explicit, I believe, in the Christian's presentation, that PPAs are a very important part of the power system transition because of the innovation, and just things will happen that we don't know yet, and which will really be developed by the market participants because they see the opportunities and then move into that space. So this is, I hope, Naomi Chevillard, this was a good response to your question. I think it also replies to one part of the question by Monika Morawiecka from RAP. Let me just go to another question by Lars Stefan. And perhaps Christian Nabe, this is for you, because when you were presenting this broader overview of the different elements being discussed in the UK context, you were then zooming in on the specific ideas that we are really taking for serious as contributions in the short term to dealing with the crisis situation, to helping in the crisis situation. So and you didn't really elaborate on other elements of the power market design, particularly wholesale power market design, where I believe Lars Stefan is asking. So my understanding is that the solutions we are offering would all coexist with the current system of marginal pricing as we have it, which of course has very important implications for incentives also on the demand side, investment incentives on the demand side of the market. And perhaps if there is a real issue there, it's the inframargin revenue cap that we have put into place in the emergency situation in which we are. And the question for how long such a cap would exist, of course, does have an impact on investments, also on the demand side of the market. Perhaps Christian Nave, you can comment on that one as well.
Yeah, exactly. So, and we were not specifically looking at the short-term measures, and we also were not looking at all the measures of redistribution and helping customers with facing energy scarcity and social aspects, things like that. I'm not saying that this is not important. This is really important. But this is not a fundamental power market design question. It becomes a question then if our gas crisis persists for a long time, and then we come into a situation where these measures become established, and they're not designed to be established because they cost a lot of money. But we have to think about, let's say, the medium term. We hope that the war in Ukraine will come to an end eventually, and the market will get to a new equilibrium. And this is the situation we have to prepare for. And by that time, we hope that short-term measures will be able to be phased out then. But then we have to be prepared for the new situation with a new market prices, new equilibrium, but also even more renewables, substantially more renewables that in the market, and they need support.
Thank you, Christian. I have another question by Monika Mobawicka, and this is actually an interesting one. No, I mean, of course, they're all interesting, but I find it's intellectually for me interesting. So, Monika, no judgment on your question. But it's the question is, how would you incentivize the uptake of CFDs for existing resources? Because what we've been presenting, Christian Riedel, if I understand correctly, is mostly looking at the new resources, the new renewables being built. So we would be talking about a growing volume of renewables under this voluntary CFD regime. But of course, looking at the overall commitment to quadruple or triple deployment rates, this could be a significant share, but not in the short term. So the question is, I believe, Monika, on the short term, what about existing resources? What's the thinking there? Anyone in the round that has an idea? Otherwise, I offer an idea myself. Konstantin?
Yeah, just very briefly recurring to this interest rate and the investor certainty issue. I mean, there are quite a few renewables that, for various reasons, age, option design, whatever, can take advantage of high market prices, but they don't know how low it might get in the end. I mean, even the current crisis has brought us some surprises on the good side. If I look at gasoline prices, for example, compared to just a few months ago. So who knows really where natural gas prices will end up, and who knows really what that means for the power prices a year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now. So the certainty that some of them might regain that they don't have now coupled with the interest rate advantages that might bring to them in general, even though there might, stuff is already invested, but they might need the money for something else. This could play a role. And if the state encourages that strongly, that might also play a little bit of a role. We always think economic actors are purely economic, but there's many reasons to doubt that. And there's very different kinds of investors in the power market. Who knows what public pressure or the pressure of their precise customers will do for them. It's worth trying, we believe. Interested to hear your answer, Matthias, also.
No, it's precisely the same. I think the considerations why you would enter into a CFD framework, of course, you're limiting the potential revenues, but you're gaining a lot of certainty for your investment. And there are many investors out there, in particular institutional investors, which are preferring stability of returns over peak returns, over very, very high returns, and for very good reasons. I mean, pension funds in particular. So I think it's really a mix of consideration, as Konstantin says, and of course you could organize auctions for existing renewable capacity in the market and see how much of the existing capacity would be willing to come into such a voluntary regime. Could be tested, let's see. And as Konstantin says, probably the jury would be out to what extent this would be taken up. In addition, I think this is something Christian mentioned. I can just want to flag this. One of the clear advantages I would see is for all these renewables projects that get some support, you always need to go through the state aid approval procedure. And of course, if there's a standard CFD regime that is like a blueprint that can be used, it's a bit like a plug and play system where I would see that state aid approval specifically would not be needed. So it would be a very fast, low transaction costs regime, in my view. But it's, of course, something to be developed as well from the EU side. There's another question, and perhaps Christian, that's for you, because we're also working in another study at the moment by Jan van de Putte on how do capacity mechanisms fit with this proposal. Because, of course, in the current security of supply crisis, we are also increasingly reflecting on capacity mechanisms. Christian.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for the question. I mean, it's of course a bit of a broader picture, which also applies generally throughout and has been discussed extensively ahead of the clean energy package. I expect the discussion to pick up momentum next year. But in a nutshell, from an energy system or energy transition perspective, it's really, I think, first of all, what is security of supply? I mean, there are different terms out there, but let's assume we both need, I mean, first of all, enough capacity to meet demand in real time, but also the dynamics of the whole system need to be tackled efficiently. So again, that's what I was referring to when saying it's not about only the amount of capacity in gigawatts that is installed, but also the flexibility potential, the ramping capabilities, etc. These technologies have. And as such, it's very important. We talked a lot about efficient integration of new flexibility options, demand side response, that also the power prices are not distorted by any, let's call it capacity market still. Because typically parts of the revenues are then transferred to this parallel market segment, the capacity market. This typically has a downward pressure on wholesale market prices. So in that sense, one could say maybe average wholesale prices drop a bit, but again, I mean, payments show up then in the other markets. So from an overall cost perspective, it's maybe not so much difference, but it's really the angle of the transition friendliness that experience has shown that market-wide capacity mechanisms have a tendency to procure a bit more capacity than needed. I mean, obviously, system operators, they don't want to take too many risks. That's one point. But again, also in terms of the features of technical prequalification, it's typically power plants, so generation technologies, that are treated somewhat preferentially compared to, let's say, forms of storage or demand response. And as such, these mechanisms, if they were implemented, they would increasingly need to take into account also, let's say, fairer treatment of new flexibility options. But maybe last remark, aside these capacity mechanisms, there are also instruments that can improve pricing within the market, the energy markets. This can also lower any concerns about the infamous missing money, so that projects do not earn their full investment costs from energy-only market sales. And this again contributes to this discussion we had. More efficient pricing is needed for this range of flexibility options and their efficient dispatch. So, but I'm sure we will have quite some discussions in the next years on all these specific options and elements.
Yes, thank you, Christian. We're already over time. So as much as I would like to continue to debate, we have to close the discussion, let's say the live discussion part here, on all the topics where we couldn't reply during the Q&A part of this webinar. We will make an effort to reply in writing to you subsequently, also sending some additional links to studies undertaken, etc. For me, it's just to thank Christian Nabe, Konstantin, Stachus, and also my colleague Christian Redl for your excellent presentation and your very clear replies to the questions raised. And Nicola, I hand over to you, and thanks to all the audience for staying on for such a long time and asking really good questions. Of course, this is only the beginning of the conversation, because power market design will really be at the center of political attention over the next few months, and it's important to get it right, as you have heard. Thank you. Nicola.
Thanks, Matthias. And I strongly recommend to register for our newsletters to be kept up to date on the work Agora is doing into that direction. Thanks to the panel and thanks to the audience.